Think about a figure at the heart of billions of people's beliefs, yet someone whose story is told in, well, dramatically different ways across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Yeah, we're talking about Ishmael, or Ismail as he's known in the Quran.
It really makes you wonder why one person can hold such contrasting significance, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, and that's what makes this such a rich area for a deep dive. We've gathered a fascinating array of sources, everything from foundational theological texts like the Torah, the New Testament, and the Quran,
Right.
to in-depth academic reports synthesizing historical and archaeological findings from the Hejaz region, and even scientific data looking at, the geology, water sources, population genetics.
Exactly. Our goal today is to really unpack the figure of Ishmael by moving beyond just a surface-level understanding. We want to weave together these diverse perspectives to grasp why he's portrayed so distinctly. And for you, our listeners, someone who's maybe keen to absorb knowledge efficiently, thoroughly, who appreciates seeing different sides of a story and those satisfying aha moments without feeling, overwhelmed, this deep dive is designed specifically for you.
And what's immediately striking is this central tension, the fundamentally different portrayals of Ishmael in Judaism and Christianity compared to Islam.
Yeah.
These aren't just minor variations. They touch upon core theological concepts like covenant, lineage, and the very nature of divine promise. It's pretty fundamental stuff.
Okay, let's dive right into the foundational texts then, starting with the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. How is Ishmael introduced and developed there?
Well, in Genesis, Ishmael's story begins with his birth to Hagar, who is Sarah's Egyptian maidservant. And the meaning of his name, God hears, is quite telling, isn't it?
God hears.
It reflects Hagar's distress in the wilderness and God's response to her plight. Then there's a significant prophecy given about Ishmael. His descendants will be numerous, and he will be a wild ass of a man.
Oh, wild ass of a man.
Yeah, suggesting a life marked by independence and perhaps a degree of conflict. It's quite a striking image.
And the covenant, that central agreement between God and Abraham in the Torah, where does Ishmael fit in all that?
This is a key distinction. The Torah explicitly states that God's everlasting covenant with Abraham will be established through Isaac, not Ishmael.
Okay.
Now, Abraham expresses concern for Ishmael, naturally, and God assures him that Ishmael will also be blessed, father 12 princes, become a great nation.
So he does get a blessing.
He does, but it's presented as a separate promise. It's distinct from that primary covenantal lineage that continues through Isaac.
Got it.
We also see Ishmael's circumcision at age 13. It shows participation in the practice, but the text makes it clear. The main divine promise, covenant, flows through Isaac. Ishmael is sort of positioned outside that central line.
Then there's that dramatic episode around Isaac's weaning feast. What happens there? That seems pretty significant for Ishmael's story.
Oh, definitely. Sarah observes Ishmael playing, or perhaps even scoffing. The Hebrew word metzachek is a bit ambiguous. It can mean both.
Playing or scoffing, interesting.
Right. And Sarah gets concerned that Ishmael might interfere with Isaac's inheritance, so she demands that Abraham expel Hagar and Ishmael.
Wow. And Abraham?
He's initially reluctant, distressed even, but God reassures him, tells him not to worry, that Ishmael will become a great nation and will be protected. So Abraham ultimately complies.
Which leads to that really well-known story of Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness of Beersheba, right? Running out of water, facing death.
Exactly. It's a desperate moment. But then, divine intervention. God hears Ishmael's cry. There's that name meaning again. God hears. An angel reassures Hagar, and boom, a well is revealed. Saves them.
And this well isn't the Zamzam well from Islamic tradition?
No, that's important. This is in the wilderness of Beersheba, according to Genesis, geographically distinct from Mecca. Genesis then tells us Ishmael grows up in the wilderness of Paran, becomes a skilled archer, marries an Egyptian woman.
Does he reconnect with Isaac later?
Yes. Interestingly, he joins Isaac to bury their father, Abraham. And the text lists his 12 sons, their settlements, and notes his death at the age of 137.
So if we were to summarize his role in Genesis, what are the key takeaways? How is he characterized?
Well, in Genesis, Ishmael is definitely portrayed as secondary to Isaac. He's associated primarily with the wilderness, maybe some conflict, fulfilling that earlier prophecy.
Right, the wild ass of a man.
Yeah. His story largely serves to highlight Isaac's chosen status as the inheritor of the primary covenant. It's also striking how little he speaks in the text.
He's mostly silent.
Pretty much. The narrative often emphasizes this distinction between birth according to the flesh, that's Ishmael, and birth according to the promise, that's Isaac. Ishmael receives blessings, sure, but he's excluded from that central covenant that defines Israelite identity.
Okay, that gives us a very clear picture from the Torah. Now let's pivot to the Quran. How does the portrayal of Ishmael differ? Because you said it's substantial.
Oh, it's night and day, really. In the Quran, Ishmael holds a far more central and revered position. Right away, you look at Surah 37, it recounts Abraham's prayer for a righteous son and then the glad tidings of a forbearing son.
A forbearing son.
Yes, Halim. And this son is overwhelmingly understood within Islamic tradition to be Ismail. This immediately sets a totally different tone for his importance. It's not just a name swap. It fundamentally reorients the narrative of divine favor around Ismail in this context.
And then we get to that pivotal event, the divine command for Abraham to sacrifice his son. Who is that son in the Quranic narrative?
This is the absolute crucial point of divergence. While the son isn't explicitly named in those core verses of Surah 37,
He isn't named.
not in the verses describing the command and submission itself, but the overwhelming long-standing consensus in Islamic tradition identifies him as Ismail. The narrative powerfully emphasizes Ismail's willing submission to God's command. He says, "O my father, do as you are commanded."
That submission is key.
It's everything. It's the essence of Islam's submission. And this act becomes central to Ismail's characterization. Then, of course, divine intervention occurs. A momentous sacrifice, a ram, is provided as ransom.
And Isaac. Where does he fit into this sequence in the Quran?
What's really significant textually in Surah 37 is that the glad tidings of Isaac's birth come after this trial involving the sacrifice.
After, okay, that's a major structural difference from Genesis 22.
Exactly. It strongly implies the son in the trial wasn't Isaac.
Are there other parts of the Quran that highlight Ismail's significance?
Absolutely. Surah 2, Al-Baqarah, describes Abraham and Ismail together raising the foundations of the Kaaba in Mecca.
Building the Kaaba together.
Yes, co-builders of Islam's holiest site. And they pray together for acceptance and for a Muslim nation to arise from their descendants. Then Surah 19, Maryam, praises Ismail as true to his promise, a messenger, Rasul, and prophet, Nabi, who enjoined prayer and charity and was pleasing to his Lord.
Messenger and prophet, that's high status.
Very high.
Yeah.
He's also mentioned elsewhere for his patience, and that quality of forbearance, Halim, we mentioned earlier.
So the characterization is just starkly different. How would you summarize Ismail's role as depicted in the Quran?
He's a major prophet and messenger, no question, lauded for these core virtues: forbearance, patience, truthfulness, Sadiq al-Wad, righteousness, Mardiya. His submission during the sacrifice embodies Islam. His role in building the Kaaba is foundational to Islamic sacred history.
And like Ishmael in Genesis, does Ismail speak much in the Quran?
Interestingly, no, very little. Only really that one response to Abraham about the sacrifice. Yet his symbolic importance in these foundational events, the sacrifice, the Kaaba, is just immense. It's less about detailed biography and more about his role in establishing key tenets and places of Islam.
Let's dig into that sacrifice narrative, the dib, a bit more. You said the son isn't explicitly named in the key verses. Why the strong identification with Ismail Islamic tradition? What are the arguments?
Yeah, it's a cornerstone interpretation. There are several main reasons. Firstly, the simple fact that Ismail was Abraham's firstborn son.
Right.
And for over 13 years, his only son. So the thinking goes, God's command would naturally refer to this unique, cherished son at that time.
Makes sense.
Secondly, as we just discussed, the timing in Surah 37, the news of Isaac's future birth, verse 112, comes after the account of the sacrifice test, verses 102 to 107. This structure strongly suggests the son in the test wasn't Isaac.
Okay, the sequence is key.
Very key. And thirdly, Ismail is specifically described just before the trial begins in verse 101 as forbearing Halim. This quality directly reflects his patient and willing submission described just verses later. It fits the character shown in the trial.
So those 3 points: firstborn, the son status, the textual sequence, and the description forbearing.
Exactly. While some very early Islamic scholars might have debated it or considered Isaac, the overwhelming and long-established consensus firmly identifies Ismail. And, the slight ambiguity in the Quranic text itself allowed this interpretation to solidify.
And that interpretation had broader implications.
Absolutely. It powerfully connected the Arabs, traditionally seen as descendants of Ismail, directly into the main line of Abrahamic legacy and trial, strengthening a distinct Islamic identity and its claims to Abrahamic legitimacy.
So we have these really, really different textual portrayals. Can we just quickly highlight the absolute key divergences?
Sure. Number one, obviously the sacrifice narrative. Isaac in the Torah Ismail in dominant Islamic tradition. The theological weight of that difference, covenant confirmation versus ultimate submission, is huge for each faith.
Right.
Number two, the wilderness narratives. Genesis depicts an expulsion due to conflict. Islamic tradition often reframes it as a purposeful, divinely guided relocation, setting the stage for Mecca and the Kaaba. The context and meaning are totally different.
Expulsion versus relocation. Got it.
And number three, prophetic status. Ishmael is not a prophet in Judaism. Ismail is a major prophet and messenger in Islam. It fundamentally defines how each tradition relates back to Abraham.
And you mentioned, despite Ismail's high status in the Quran, there are fewer specific life details compared to Ishmael in Genesis.
Yeah, it's noticeable. There's less narrative detail about his day-to-day life compared to Genesis. It suggests his primary role in the Quran is perhaps more symbolic, tied to these pivotal foundational moments, the ultimate test of faith, the building of the central sanctuary.
Okay. Now, beyond Judaism and Islam, how does Christianity typically view Ishmael? Is there a dominant interpretation?
Yes, largely through the lens of the Apostle Paul, particularly in his letter to the Galatians. Paul uses the story allegorically.
Allegorically? How so?
He contrasts Ishmael, born to Hagar, the slave woman, representing the old covenant of law, sort of bondage under the law, with Isaac, born to Sarah, the free woman, representing the new covenant of promise and freedom found through faith in Christ.
So it's a symbolic reading, reinforcing Isaac's line as leading to Christ.
Precisely. It fits Ishmael into the Christian narrative of salvation history, but clearly secondary to Isaac, who represents the line of promise culminating in Christianity.
And what about this text that sometimes comes up, the Gospel of Barnabas? It mentions Ishmael as the one to be sacrificed, right?
It does, yes. The Gospel of Barnabas presents a narrative that aligns more closely with the Islamic perspective on the sacrifice and some other points.
So what's the deal with that text?
Well, here's the crucial thing. The overwhelming scholarly consensus across the board is that the Gospel of Barnabas is a late work. It's considered a pseudepigraphon, meaning falsely attributed, in this case, to the Apostle Barnabas.
Late. Like how late?
Likely medieval, probably 14th to 16th century. It contains numerous historical and theological errors, things that just don't fit the first century context. It actually contradicts both the canonical Christian New Testament and the Quran on various points.
So, academically, it's not seen as a reliable source for early history.
Not at all. While you might see it referenced sometimes in popular discussions or apologetics, academic scholars, historians, textual critics, religious studies experts generally dismiss it as having no historical value for understanding the origins of either Christianity or Islam. It's a much later creation reflecting later agendas.
Okay, that clarifies its status.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears now, move from the texts to the ground, so to speak. The historical and archaeological context of the Hijaz region. What does the evidence tell us about that area in ancient times, say, around the patriarchal era?
Right. For a long time, the popular image and even some older scholarship pictured pre-Islamic Arabia, especially the interior, as almost entirely nomadic, just Bedouins and camels.
Yeah, that's the common picture.
But archaeological work, particularly in northwestern Arabia, which includes the Hijaz, has really changed that view over the last few decades. We're finding significant evidence of settled life, of oasis-based communities going way back
Far
into the Bronze Age, 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. We see evidence of what scholars sometimes call low urbanization or slow urbanism at sites like Taima, Koraya, Dumat el-Jandal, and a more recently explored site, Al-Nata, in the Khaybar Oasis.
And what kind of evidence are we talking about?
Things like fortified towns, distinct residential areas, maybe administrative zones, large cemeteries, necropoles. It shows complex, settled societies were present.
So societies existed in that region around the broad time frame associated with the biblical patriarchs.
Exactly. Now, this doesn't prove the specific stories about Abraham and Ishmael in a particular place like Mecca at that exact time. We can't make that direct archaeological link yet, but it does provide a plausible socioeconomic backdrop.
It shows that settled life, interactions, maybe even sacred sites were possible then.
Precisely. It counters the idea that it was only nomads. It confirms complex societies existed, supporting the general setting of such narratives, even if the specifics remain debated. And later, in the Iron Age, centers like Taima and Dedan were clearly important hubs, interacting with big empires like the Neo-Babylonians, Nabateans, Romans, while coexisting with nomadic groups, these dimorphic societies.
Okay, so complex societies were there. Now, what about Mecca specifically? Obviously, it's central to the Islamic narrative. What does the archaeological record reveal about early Mecca?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting and frankly quite debated. It's often called the Mecca problem in academic circles.
The Mecca problem. Why?
Because despite decades of archaeological work across Arabia and finding thousands upon thousands of inscriptions detailing kings, tribes, gods, cities, dating back millennia, there is a striking, noticeable absence of any known archaeological finds or pre-Islamic inscriptions that explicitly mention Mecca or confirm it as a significant settlement during the patriarchal era or even for centuries after that.
No mention at all in early sources.
No clear, undisputed mention in datable pre-Islamic inscriptions or contemporary external sources referring to it as a major town or sanctuary in that early period. This lack is really noticeable when you compare it to how well documented other Arabian sites are, like Taima or Najran or Qaryat al-Fa.
That is surprising, given its later immense importance.
It is, and it led scholars, most famously Patricia Crone in the late 20th century, to fundamentally challenge the traditional Islamic view of pre-Islamic Mecca.
What was her argument?
She argued, based on this lack of early evidence and inconsistencies in later accounts, that Mecca likely wasn't the major international spice trade hub described in later Islamic tradition. She suggested it was probably a minor local shrine, maybe not even originally in the Hijaz location we know today, and that its importance was largely projected backwards after Islam's rise.
Wow, that's a controversial thesis.
Hugely controversial. It sparked intense debate, and there are many counterarguments focusing on interpreting later sources differently or limitations in archaeological access. But Crone's work, and that of others in that revisionist school, forced a critical reevaluation of how we use later Islamic sources to reconstruct pre-Islamic history and raise serious questions about Mecca's assumed great antiquity.
So how do people interpret this absence of early evidence for Mecca? What are the possible explanations?
Well, there are a few possibilities. One is, as Crone suggested, that Mecca's great significance and its connection to Abrahamic narratives developed later, perhaps primarily in the 6th and 7th centuries CE, and these narratives were then retroactively applied to enhance its sanctity.
Okay, a later sacralization.
Another factor is the sheer difficulty of doing archaeology in modern Mecca. It's a densely populated, continuously inhabited sacred city with massive ongoing development. It's incredibly hard to access potential ancient layers.
Practical challenges.
And a third perspective is that maybe the traditional accounts operate more on a theological plane, conveying religious truth and lineage, rather than aiming for strict, literal historical accuracy in the modern sense. But based on the current archaeological and epigraphic evidence, the picture of Mecca as a major ancient center going back to Abraham's time is not supported. It raises questions.
Let's talk about the Kaaba itself. What can archaeology and history tell us about its origins, separate from the Mecca debate?
Okay, there's a broad agreement among historians and archaeologists that the Kaaba structure existed as a sanctuary before Islam. It was a pre-Islamic shrine, likely housing various idols worshipped by different Arabian tribes, which Muhammad later cleansed. That part is pretty well established.
Right, and the Quranic statement about Abraham and Ishmael raising the foundations.
That's the foundational Islamic belief, yes. Surah 2 mentions them raising, or perhaps rebuilding, on earlier foundations. But again, direct archaeological evidence that confirms that specific event or dates the original structure definitively to Abraham's time, roughly 2nd millennium BCE. We don't have that.
Why not? Can't they date the stones?
The problem is the Kaaba has been rebuilt and renovated numerous times throughout history. We have historical accounts of major rebuilds, like one by the Quraysh tribe around 608 CE, which Muhammad himself participated in before his prophethood, and another major rebuild after damage by Abdul ibn al-Zubayr in the late 7th century, and further modifications under various caliphs and rulers. So the structure we see today incorporates materials and designs from many different periods. It's impossible to archaeologically isolate an original Abrahamic layer.
But key elements associated with it, like the Black Stone, Maqam Ibrahim, Hebrew Ismail, they have history.
Yes, they are integral parts of the Kaaba complex with their own rich histories and traditions, often linked back to Abraham and Ismail in Islamic belief, even if their precise origins are also shrouded in antiquity and tradition rather than archaeology.
Okay, what about the Zamzam well? That's so tied to Hagar and Ishmael in the Islamic story. What's the historical and archaeological take?
The traditional Islamic account, found strongly in Hadith and later literature, though not detailed in the Quran itself, is that the Zamzam well miraculously sprang up to save Hagar and Ishmael when they were near death in the Valley of Mecca. That's a core belief.
Right.
Now, historically, there's an interesting tradition about its rediscovery. It said that the well had been buried or lost for centuries, possibly filled in by a tribe called Juhum, who were expelled from Mecca.
It was lost.
According to this tradition, yes. And it was rediscovered by Abd al-Muttalib, the grandfather of Prophet Muhammad, probably sometime in the 6th century CE, guided by dreams.
What does that imply?
Well, it suggests a period where this supposedly ancient vital well wasn't known or accessible. Some scholars also point to the pre-Islamic role of Siqaya providing water to pilgrims, often from cisterns or other sources managed by Quraysh leaders before Abd al-Muttalib. They argue this suggests there wasn't a readily available, superabundant source like Zamzam right next to the Kaaba known to everyone at that time. The rediscovery narrative might explain its sudden prominence.
And archaeology. Can they date the well itself?
The Zamzam well certainly exists today, near the Kaaba. It's a hand-dug well, about 30 meters deep. But archaeologically, there's no way to directly date its origin to the time of Hagar and Ishmael. Attempts you might see trying to link it to, say, ancient Egyptian records are highly speculative and lack solid evidence. The primary basis for its ancient origin story remains firmly within Islamic tradition.
It really is striking, isn't it? How the rich religious narratives provide one timeline and level of detail, while the archaeological record often suggests something different, or at least is silent on key points.
It is, and it's amplified when you consider the broader context.
What do you mean?
I mean, the pre-Islamic inscriptions and sanctuaries found elsewhere in the Hejaz and Arabia. The peninsula is incredibly rich in epigraphic evidence, thousands of inscriptions on rocks, tombs, buildings, from monumental royal decrees down to simple graffiti.
Recording names, gods, events.
Exactly. Names of people, tribes, deities, records of building projects, battles, religious practices. And we know there were numerous pre-Islamic sanctuaries, pilgrimage sites, sacred enclosures, haram or hima, at various oases and other locations.
So the means and the practice of recording history and marking sacred space existed widely.
Absolutely. For centuries before Islam, people in Arabia knew how to write, they recorded important things, they designated sacred areas, which makes the absence of similar early evidence specifically mentioning Mecca as a major center, or the Kaaba in its Abrahamic context, or Zamzam, all the more noticeable and, frankly, puzzling for historians trying to reconcile the different kinds of evidence. It underscores those questions about Mecca's specific role in antiquity before the 7th century.
Okay, let's shift focus again now to the scientific dimensions.
Yeah.
How do fields like geology, geochemistry, genetics add to this complex picture? Starting with geology.
Well, the geology of Mecca is pretty straightforward. It's located in Wadi Ibrahim, a dry river valley, surrounded by these ancient, rugged, Precambrian, igneous, and metamorphic mountains of the Hejaz Range. There are alluvial plains formed by sediment deposits, which are crucial for groundwater. And of course, urban development has massively altered the natural landscape over time.
And Safa and Marwa, the two hills from the Hagar story.
Geologically, they are small hills or rocky outcrops near the Kaaba, part of that same Hejaz mountain range. Their significance is entirely tied to the Islamic narrative of Hagar's desperate search for water between them. Geologically, they're just features of the local landscape.
Now, Zamzam water itself, you mentioned scientific data. What have scientists found about it? Geochemistry.
Right. Hydrogeologically, the well draws water from the sandy alluvium of the wadi and also from fractures in the underlying bedrock. Its level is influenced by rainfall, sometimes quite far away, that recharges the aquifer.
And chemically, is it unique?
It does have a distinct chemical signature. It's generally alkaline with a high level of total dissolved solids, TDS, meaning it's rich in minerals. Things like calcium, magnesium, sodium, chloride, bicarbonates, sulfates. Also trace elements like fluoride and lithium. This profile comes from the water interacting with the specific rocks it flows through.
Has there ever been concern about its quality?
Historically, yes. Because it's in an urban area and heavily used, there have been past concerns and studies looking at things like nitrates or trace elements like arsenic. However, the Saudi authorities monitor it closely, and recent studies generally show these elements are within acceptable limits for drinking water, especially with modern management. It's also consistently found to be free of disease-causing pathogens.
So its unique mineral mix gives it a distinct taste and feel.
Exactly. And this unique, observable geochemical profile provides a tangible basis for why it's been historically revered. It bridges that gap between observation, this water tastes different, feels different, and faith, it's blessed.
What about the health claims often associated with Zamzam water?
Traditionally, and in some modern literature, various health benefits are attributed to it. But Scientifically speaking, it's really important to emphasize that most of these claims lack rigorous, large-scale human clinical trials conducted according to modern medical standards.
So safe to drink, but specific medicinal effects aren't proven.
That's the distinction, yes. We can verify its safety for consumption and its unique mineral content, but widespread claims about curing specific diseases are generally not supported by robust scientific evidence yet.
Okay, now let's talk genetics. This comes up a lot connecting modern Arabs to Ishmael. What can genetics actually tell us?
It's a fascinating but complex area. The discussion often centers on Y-DNA haplogroups, which trace paternal lineage. Haplogroup J1, specifically the JM267 marker, is found at very high frequencies in many Arab populations, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula.
J1.
It's thought to have originated somewhere in the Near East or Anatolia thousands of years ago, and its spread in Arabia might be linked to various movements, including perhaps Bronze Age expansions and certainly later Islamic expansions. You also find it in North Africa, largely due to Arab migrations.
And how does this connect to Ishmael?
Well, traditional Arab genealogy divides Arabs into main groups, including the Adnanites, who are considered descendants of Adnan, who is traditionally traced back to Ishmael through his son Kedar. The Quraysh tribe, Muhammad's tribe, are considered Adnanites.
Right.
And genetic studies have found that haplogroup J1, especially certain subclades like J1P58, is particularly common among populations who traditionally identify with this Adnanite lineage.
So does that mean J1 proves Ishmaelite descent?
This is where we need serious caution. No. Genetics cannot definitively prove a direct lineage back to a specific individual like Ishmael who lived maybe 3,500, 4,000 years ago. The time depth is just too great, and populations mix over time.
So it's more of a correlation.
Exactly. The high frequency of J1, particularly J1P58, in populations with Adnanite traditions provides an interesting correlation or a circumstantial link. It shows shared ancestry among these groups dating back thousands of years. But it's not proof of descent from Ishmael himself. It's a potential genetic echo of ancient population structures and traditions, but it remains speculative at the individual level.
What about maternal lineage as mtDNA?
mtDNA studies paint a picture of Arabia as a real crossroads. You see maternal lineages with origins in Africa, like L haplogroups, U6M1, West Eurasia Near East, each JTUK, and parts of Asia, other M lineages. It shows people moving into and through Arabia for millennia, making it a corridor and recipient of migrations, rather than necessarily a primary source point for major ancient haplogroups.
So the genetic picture is complex, showing connections, but not simple, direct lines back thousands of years to one person.
Precisely. Shared ancestry, yes. Specific individual descent from figures like Ishmael, genetically unprovable.
Okay, one last scientific angle. Paleoclimate.
Yeah.
How has the climate in Arabia changed, and why might that matter here?
Research using things like lake sediment cores and cave formations shows that Arabia wasn't always as arid as it is today. There was a period, roughly in the early to mid-Holocene, say 9,000 to 6,000 years ago, often called the African humid period, where much of Arabia was significantly wetter, greener, with lakes and rivers.
Greener.
Yes, quite different. But from the mid-Holocene onwards, starting maybe around 6,000 years ago and continuing through the Bronze Age and later periods when these narratives are set, the climate generally became progressively more arid, closer to what we see today.
So it was drying out during the time of Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac.
Generally, yes. The trend was towards increasing aridity, and the implication for the Hejaz and Mecca region is clear. Reliable water sources would have become increasingly critical for survival and settlement.
So a story about a miraculous, divinely provided well like Zamzam
would gain immense significance in a landscape where water was becoming scarcer and more precious. The changing climate could potentially elevate the importance of narratives explaining the origin of such a vital resource as an act of divine providence in an increasingly harsh environment. It adds another layer of context to why the Zamzam story might resonate so powerfully.
Fascinating. Let's move into a comparative context now.
Yeah.
The story motif itself, a father commanded to sacrifice his son, that's not unique to the Abrahamic traditions, is it? We see echoes elsewhere.
Not at all. It's a powerful recurring motif found in various ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean cultures. There are textual references, often debated, to child sacrifice associated with deities like Molech in the Levant. Archaeologically, we have the Punic Tefets cemeteries containing urns with the cremated remains of infants and young children, sometimes animals, often interpreted as evidence of child sacrifice, though the exact nature and scale are debated.
And parallels in Greek mythology, too.
Oh, definitely. You have the story of King Athamas being commanded to sacrifice his son Phrixus, who is saved at the last minute by a golden ram sent by the gods.
A ram, just like in the Abrahamic stories.
Exactly. And the famous story of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter, whom he is commanded by Artemis to sacrifice to get favorable winds for the Trojan War. In most versions, Artemis substitutes a deer for Iphigenia at the last moment and whisks her away.
So, similar structures. Divine command, intended sacrifice, last-minute intervention, often involving an animal substitute. What do scholars make of these parallels?
There's debate. Is it direct cultural borrowing? Are these just manifestations of a shared human archetype dealing with themes of sacrifice, obedience, divine power, and the value of life? Or maybe echoes of some very ancient, dimly remembered cultural practices? The structural similarities and sometimes inversions are certainly striking.
But you mentioned earlier the Abrahamic narratives seem to subvert this motif in a key way.
Yes, that's crucial. While they use the framework of the command to sacrifice, the absolute climax and theological point in both the Genesis and Quranic versions is the divine intervention that prevents the child's death. The test is about faith, obedience, submission, not about actually carrying out the killing.
So they establish substitution instead.
Precisely. They use the terrifying motif to ultimately reject human sacrifice and establish the principle of substitution, the ram, and emphasize divine mercy and provision. It becomes foundational for understanding covenant, obedience, and the nature of God within Judaism and Islam, marking a clear break from perceived pagan practices.
We've touched on lineage already, connecting Ishmael to Arab identity through tradition and the potential J1 genetic link. Can we just reiterate that connection?
Sure. Traditional Islamic genealogies place Ishmael as the progenitor of the Mustariba, or Arabized Arabs, distinct from the supposedly pure Arabs of southern Arabia, Qatanites. This line runs through Ishmael's son Kedar down to Adnan, who is considered the ancestor of most northern and central Arabian tribes, crucially including the Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad.
So it's vital for positioning Arabs, especially Muhammad's lineage, within the Abrahamic heritage.
Absolutely vital. It establishes a direct link back to Abraham through his firstborn son, grounding Islamic identity and claims within that prestigious monotheistic lineage.
And the genetics connection again.
As we said, the high prevalence of Y-DNA haplogroup J1, especially J1P58, in populations traditionally linked to Adnan offers a tantalizing correlation. It suggests deep shared ancestry among these groups, but again, proving direct descent from Ishmael himself via genetics is impossible across such a vast time frame. The genetic landscape of Arabia is complex, showing lots of mixing. J1 provides circumstantial support for the traditional grouping, not definitive proof of the specific founding ancestor.
Finally, in this comparative section, how does the legacy of Ishmael and Hagar live on, not just in belief, but in actual Islamic religious practice today? It seems very tangible.
Oh, incredibly tangible. It's woven right into the fabric of the most important Islamic rituals, particularly the Hajj and Umrah pilgrimages to Mecca.
How so?
Well, the ritual, walking or running back and forth 7 times between the small hills of Safa and Marwa near the Kaaba, directly commemorates Hagar's desperate search for water for Ishmael. Pilgrims physically reenact her steps.
Wow.
Drinking water from the Zamzam well connects pilgrims directly to that moment of divine intervention and relief. It's an integral part of the experience.
And the sacrifice story.
That's commemorated globally by Muslims during Eid al-Adha, the festival of sacrifice. The ritual slaughter of an animal, like a sheep, goat, or cow, honors Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son, identified as Ismail in Islamic tradition, and God's provision of the ram.
Anything else?
Even the Rami al-Jamarat, the ritual stoning of 3 pillars at Mina during Hajj, is traditionally interpreted by many as reenacting Abraham's, Hagar's, and Ismail's rejection of Satan, who supposedly tempted them to disobey God's command regarding the sacrifice.
So the whole narrative is physically replayed.
In many ways, yes. And of course, the Kaaba itself, believed to have been built by Abraham and Ismail, serves as the Qibla, the single direction towards which all Muslims around the world turn for prayer 5 times a day.
That's powerful. It really moves the story beyond just text.
Absolutely. These rituals make the sacred history associated with Mecca, Abraham, Hagar, and Ismail a lived, embodied reality for Muslims. It reinforces collective identity, grounds faith in tangible actions and sacred geography, and makes the foundational narratives communally binding in a way that reading alone doesn't.
Okay, so as we try to bring all these threads together now, the text, the history, archaeology, science, comparisons, what are the key conclusions we can draw from this deep dive into the figure of Ishmael Ismail?
I think the main takeaway is just how multifaceted and honestly contested this figure is across different domains of knowledge and belief. We see radically contrasting portrayals in the foundational texts, secondary figure in Genesis, central prophet in the Quran.
Right, the textual contrast is stark.
Then we have the historical and archaeological evidence, which raises significant questions about the traditional timelines and prominence of early Mecca, the demonstrable antiquity of the Kaaba's Abrahamic construction, and the origins of the Zamzam well. The material evidence often doesn't align neatly with the traditional narratives.
Well, the science gives context.
Exactly. Science provides context through the unique geochemistry of Zamzam water, the intriguing but not definitive prevalence of the J1 haplogroup, and the background of paleoclimate change influencing the ancient environment.
So where do things converge and diverge?
There's convergence on Ishmael being Abraham's first son, and the general existence of pre-Islamic sanctuaries in Arabia, but sharp divergence on the identity of the son in the sacrifice, the nature and recipient of the primary covenant, the purpose of the wilderness journey, Ishmael's prophetic status, and crucially, the historical antiquity and role of Mecca before Islam. Persistent ambiguities remain on many fronts.
And these really highlight some significant historiographical challenges when studying this period and these figures, don't they?
They absolutely do. There's a heavy reliance, especially for the Islamic tradition's origins, on later literary sources written down centuries after the events they describe. This requires careful source criticism.
And the tension with critical inquiry.
Yes, there's an inherent tension between accounts deeply embedded in faith traditions and the findings of critical historical and archaeological inquiry, like the work Crone and others initiated. Figures like Ishmael become focal points where faith claims about origins and lineage intersect, and sometimes clash, with historical and archaeological interpretations of evidence. You have to acknowledge these different ways of knowing, different epistemologies are often at play.
So Ishmael isn't just one thing. He's many things depending on the lens.
Precisely. He functions as a textual figure constructed differently in different scriptures, a potent theological symbol of exclusion or submission, a crucial genealogical link for millions, and a central character embedded in sacred geography and core religious rituals. These narratives aren't static, they are living traditions, constantly interpreted and reinterpreted. Foundational figures like him become lenses for understanding the past, the present, and the relationship with the divine.
What are some of the broader implications of looking at Ishmael this way, comparatively? And where might future research go?
Well, I think it really underscores the ongoing need for sensitive and informed interfaith understanding. Recognizing why these foundational narratives differ and what theological weight they carry in each tradition is crucial for dialogue.
And future research?
There are many avenues. Continued, careful archaeological work in Mecca, if feasible, and the wider Hejaz is essential. Ancient DNA studies could potentially refine our understanding of population histories and connections in Arabia, though maybe not pinpointing Ishmael himself. Comparative studies of these sacrifice motifs and other narrative elements across cultures can yield insights. And, of course, ongoing critical analysis of the primary textual sources using historical critical methods.
The goal isn't necessarily to prove or disprove faith, then.
Not at all. The goal of integrating these different disciplinary perspectives, textual, historical, archaeological, scientific, is to enrich our understanding. It adds complexity, context, nuance. Hopefully it prompts a more informed and subtle dialogue between faith, history, and science, all of which intersect in fascinating ways around the single compelling figure of Ishmael.
This deep dive has truly been a fascinating journey. It's really revealed such contrasting perspectives and intricate layers of complexity surrounding this pivotal figure, Ishmael or Ismail. It's just remarkable how one individual can hold such profoundly different meanings across major world religions.
Indeed. And hopefully you, our listener, have experienced some of those satisfying aha moments as we've explored Ishmael through these multiple lenses, the texts, the archaeology, the science. Hopefully you've gained a richer, maybe more nuanced understanding than any single viewpoint could have offered alone.
We certainly encourage you to continue reflecting on this really rich material and perhaps explore some of these questions further on your own. And maybe as a final thought to leave you with, how do these ancient narratives, with their often sharply divergent interpretations of figures like Ishmael, continue to shape modern identities, politics, and interfaith relations right up to the present day?
Yeah, and what does this ongoing interplay we've discussed between deeply held faith, critical historical inquiry, and new scientific discoveries tell us about the enduring human quest to understand our origins and our shared, sometimes contested, past?
Powerful questions indeed, ones that invite ongoing reflection.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.